Welcome back to week 3. This week we'll be covering chapter 3 on evolution, species interactions, and biological communities. This week we have, as usual, your week 3 lecture, your chapter 3 outline, your week 3 discussion, and then a little bit different this week, your week 3 lab is a video called The World in Balance, the People Paradox. And your lab points this week will come from completing a discussion on the video. So, if you look at the discussion prompt, you can see what you're looking for before. I'd recommend doing that before you watch the video, so you know what to look for in the video. And then we also have your first lecture test coming up. That closes on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. There is no time limit, so you can start it early and give yourself plenty of time. And I would just recommend, if you are looking to study or reviewing your lecture slides and videos, going through your chapter outlines. If there's anything that as you read through, you really don't remember it, go back and maybe review those sections a little more carefully. And then any lecture videos that were posted that you watch, those are also part of the exam material. And the exam will be more general rather than more specific, since there is a ton of information. I won't be really picking on little tiny details, but more broad general concepts. Here is a case study from your textbook on Darwin's Voyage of Discovery, and I'm sure you've all heard the name Darwin associated with the ideas of evolution and natural selection. And this island is important because it's been separated from the mainland for such a long period of time that the animals that live there have had a chance to adapt to this island setting and change differently than the animals that are on the mainland. So when Darwin, he was out on a voyage on a ship and hired to be a naturalist and look at all the animals in different places around the world. When he came to this island, he saw some really unique and different animals. And so this island has been studied a lot to look at the different animals that live here. And we'll talk throughout this chapter on different types of animals, their different adaptations, and how they interact with each other. As you go through this chapter, hopefully by the end, you'll learn how species diversity arises, what do we mean by tolerance limits and give examples, how do interactions aid and hinder species, why don't species always reproduce up to their full potential, what is the relationship between species diversity and community stability, what is disturbance and how it affects communities, and explain what ecological succession is and give some examples. I'd like to just first, before we start, give a note on evolution, because for some of you that may not raise any hairs, for others of you that may kind of put you on guard as you start out the chapter. And I think that for some people, it's probably one of the most controversial topics in an intro science course. And I just would like to make the note up front that my goal is not to change your personal or religious beliefs, but to educate you on the scientific ideas related to the topic. So I hope that you will review this chapter in the context of learning what many scientists believe, and but please know that your own beliefs are respected. So if you're finding it difficult to read and you don't agree with it, keep in mind that I think with any topic in life, if we have a strong viewpoint, it's always good to listen to the opposing side. I don't think we're fully educated unless we know what both sides say. And if you really want to be strong in your own convictions, it's good to listen to the other sides just to know what they're thinking, if nothing else. So I hope you'll take that viewpoint rather than a defensive viewpoint as you read it. And know, like I said, my goal is not to change your personal beliefs, but just to educate you on the scientific ideas behind the topic. Let's start out here with section 3.1. When we look at the Earth, we see an amazing amount of diversity around us. There are all kinds of different animals that have all different adaptations for the environment and the habitat that they live in. And as we go through this section, we'll look at why certain species survive in one environment or another, and why they maybe wouldn't live in a different environment, and why some species are abundant and other species are rare. So we will examine the mechanisms that change and lead to all this diversity in the life that surrounds us. Let's look at a couple terms here first. And adaptation is a trait that an organism has that lets it survive in its environment. And it's a very important concept in biology. So if you look at any organism, it has special features that allow it to be great at living where it is. And we call this an adaptation. And it's an adaptation are characteristics that can be passed from one generation to the next. So it's not things that an animal has learned to do, but things that are in their genetics that help them be good, such as being able to run fast from predators, being the right color to blend in with the environment. And every organism in a natural environment, not so much humans, but organisms in their natural environment, whoever is the best at living where they live is the most likely to reproduce and pass their genes on to the next generation and pass those good adaptations on. In contrast, if an organism was not very good at living in an area, like let's say it was not very well camouflaged to blend in, most likely it would be eaten by a predator and it wouldn't pass those genes on. So when we look at natural selection, it's simply stating that whatever organism is best at living where it's at, either blends in best or is fastest, it will reproduce and have its genes be passed on. And the organisms that don't fit in well are most likely not to reproduce and not to pass their genes on, at least not as frequently. Next here we have the topic of fitness, and being fit in science is a lot different than what we think of as being fit in our day-to-day lives. And fitness is simply based on the number of offspring who are born and survive. And the more offspring that something has, the more fit they are. And the reason that we look at the term of fitness is that the more offspring that something has, the more of their genes are passed on to the next generation. So if they have certain traits, if you're more fit, your traits are getting passed on much more frequently than organisms who are less fit. Here we have the example of a giraffe having the adaptation of a long neck. And in the case of the giraffes, when there's a shortage of food, the giraffes with the longer necks have access to more food. They can reach the leaves down low and they can reach the leaves really high. So if food were scarce, then the giraffes with the longer necks would be more likely to survive and pass their genes for long necks on to the next generation. And so as more generations go by, only the long neck genes get passed on. The short neck genes sort of get lost from the population, and giraffes over time end up with longer and longer necks because that long neck makes them better adapted to their environment. And they would call this natural selection, or the genes for long necks are, in a sense, selected for. Really, you're selecting against the short neck genes, but over time, you end up with giraffes with these long necks. Another example of a really neat adaptation is the polar bear. And polar bears, as much as they look white, actually have black skin and clear, hollow fur. And this makes them perfectly adapted for the Arctic because their clear, hollow fur helps absorb sunlight, sort of like a greenhouse effect. The black skin keeps that sunlight from being reflected, so it keeps the sunlight in the warmth next to their skin. And then they have this thick layer of blubber that stores heat. And with all that, with the combination of black hair and clear, hollow fur, they actually look white, which makes them blend in well to the Arctic. So those are some really neat adaptations of the polar bear. to really understand traits and how they are selected for in each generation, it's important to understand a little bit about what a gene is and what DNA is. So inside of your cell, in the very center of your cell, you have this sac called a nucleus, and that sac contains all of your DNA. And that DNA is like a string of codes, and each segment of DNA codes for a different, what they call gene, and you might have a gene for eye color or a gene for hair color or a set of genes that determine how tall you are. And if one of those genes gets changed, like UV radiation hitting a gene can change the gene, and then the gene, your DNA, will be read differently, and that section will code for something different. Sometimes it codes for nothing, there's no change. Sometimes there's a bad change, like something that isn't good for you. And sometimes the change every once in a while can be good. So if you get a good gene, that gene might be more likely to pass on from one generation to the next. And so that mutation can eventually lead to a change in the population. When we look at different plants and animals around the world, you probably notice that certain plants and animals live in some areas, but not in other areas, and different plants and animals might live in different areas. And that's usually because animals are adapted to the area that they live in. And beyond that, they have certain, what they call their tolerance limit, or the conditions which they can tolerate, some certain temperatures, certain amounts of water, certain nutrients in an area, and if you go outside of their tolerance limits, then they tend to not be able to survive and to not live there. An example real quick of the saguaro cactus, and this cactus can live in, as you'd think of a cactus, in desert areas, but you might wonder if it's great at extracting water from the ground and living in hot temperatures, why does it not live where it's colder? And the cactus's tolerance limit is ends where it begins to freeze. So once you start getting freezing temperatures for more than 12 hours, the tips of the cactus start to die, and then the cactus itself will eventually die off. So the cactus, you see a line geographically where the temperatures hit freezing temperatures more frequently, and then you do not see the cactuses beyond that point. Here's a look at a tolerance curve. And really all this is saying is that in the optimal range, or the conditions that are best for an organism, let's say the butterfly, there's conditions where the butterfly really does best. And if you start to move away from those conditions, so let's say into temperatures that are hotter or into temperatures that are colder, you start to see less and less of that species. The species becomes infrequent. And eventually when you get really too hot or really too cold, you won't see that species at all. Here we have the difference between a habitat and a niche, and a lot of people get these two terms confused, but a habitat is just describing the place where an organism lives, whereas the niche is describing the organism's role within that community and the place that they live. So it's describing what they do. So for example, the panda bear's habitat, it lives in regions with lots of bamboo. That would be its habitat. Its niche is to live in that bamboo area, to eat bamboo, and its niche would also include the type of amount of precipitation, the amount of the temperatures. And so habitat is just describing the place they live, whereas a niche is describing what the organism does in an area. There are generalists and specialists for niches, so essentially the job that they have or what they do in their community. They can be either very general, they can have a lot of different things they do, a lot of places they live, a lot of food they eat, a lot of organisms they interact with, or it can be they can be very specialized and only live in certain conditions and interact with maybe eat only a very limited food source, like the panda just eating bamboo, whereas the black bear eats lots of other species. And so the black bear here is our specialist. It's living in, if you look at the temperature going here on your x-axis, you have the black bear can live, and black bear is this big circle here, can live from pretty cold to pretty warm, and from pretty dry to pretty moist. The giant panda, on the other hand, if you go down to temperature, can only live in this little window of pretty warm
And on precipitation, it can only live in this little window of pretty moist. It has to be pretty warm and pretty moist. It has to have bamboo. So they are considered a specialist, or the job they have in their community, their interactions with their community is very limited. The places where they can live are very limited. The habitats they can live in are very limited. The black bear, as we said, is a specialist. It can live in a wide variety of habitats and interacts with much more variety of other organisms. The competitive exclusion principle states that no two species can occupy the same niche for long. So no two organisms are going to live in the exact same type of habitat and interact with the exact same organism. So for example, live in the same place, eat the same food for very long, because one of them, one or the other of those organisms, is usually going to be more efficient at using the resources and will exclude the other one. So if an animal is living in a certain area with another animal that's pretty similar, so let's say we're going to cover next the warbler, let's say two different types of warblers, and they both of the different warblers like to live in the top part of the tree because it's safe there, and they like to eat the same types of seeds out of the tree. One of them is going to be better at getting the seeds, and the other one is eventually going to either die or say, I have to move to a different tree or a different part of the tree somewhere else so I can get food because I'm not getting food here. So one of them is usually going to exclude the other and move to a different place where they can get the resources they need. And they call this resource partitioning. And this can allow several species to utilize different parts of the same habitat. So they can be in the same general area but have a different niche or a different role within that area. Warblers. And we have certain warblers like the Cape May warbler, the black-throated green warbler, that both live in the top of the tree, but one's more toward the outside of the tree getting the seeds. One tends to live more toward the inside of the trees getting seeds and building its nest. And then there's the yellow-rumped warbler, which more will occupy more toward the bottom of the tree. And so each of these warblers has developed a different place in the tree where it lives and does much of its day-to-day activities, and this reduces competition between all the warblers. If you look at the development of a new species, they call that speciation. And in the Galapagos Islands that we talked about earlier, Darwin did a lot of studies on finches, and other people have done a lot of studies on finches, and a lot of the speciation, or the changes that occurred in these finches, occurred because of geographic isolation. So they were so isolated from other finches that it wasn't like they were close by, and if a few changes occurred, the animals bred together and those changes sort of blended back in. But when you get changes in a species that occur, because they're separated by something like an ocean or a mountain range or a desert, they call this geographic, or they call this allopatric speciation. Other organisms might not mate because they have some kind of behavioral difference, and so they don't mate with the other organism because, you know, if it's a bird, maybe they don't like the mating dance that they're doing, or they don't like their colors of a certain bird, and so certain species stop mating with each other and reproducing and become sort of separated even though they're living in the same area because they have some behavioral characteristic that prevents reproduction. Here's an example of geographic isolation that occurred with the squirrel populations in Arizona. And a long time ago, if you look a long ways back, this part of Arizona had some mountains and forests, and it was all, though, pretty forested and pretty green and all throughout this region in Arizona. And then eventually it got drier, and they had this squirrel, sort of this, call it a sort of brownish, reddish squirrel, and that lived all over. It lived in the mountains, it lived down below inside of the valley, but it was all green everywhere, good habitat. Eventually, over time, it got drier and drier and drier there, and pretty soon the only places that the squirrel could live were up high in the mountains. And what they ended up with is that the squirrels over on this side of the mountain range in Arizona were more of a red color, and the squirrels on the other mountain range were more of a gray color. So over time, for whatever reason, the squirrels that were redder in color survived, reproduced, passed on their genes, and lived better here. And the squirrels on the other side of the mountain, only the squirrels with the gray color survived, more maybe better conditions where they could blend in better over there. And they ended up with the red squirrel over here on this mountain, the gray squirrel over here. And eventually what happens is if organisms become so different over time, even if later they could get back together, either they don't reproduce because they've been apart so long that they have behavioral characteristics, like we said, that prevent them from reproducing, or they become so different that they actually, if they did try to reproduce, they can't make fertile offspring because their genetics just become too different. So eventually what you get is organisms that become different enough that they are considered two different species. And the definition of a species is if something's the same species, it means it can reproduce and have fertile offspring. So it's not enough just to reproduce. Like a horse and a mule can reproduce, a horse and a donkey can reproduce and make a mule, but that mule, I'm not saying this right, a horse and a donkey can reproduce and make a mule, but a mule is actually sterile. They cannot have offspring, so mules cannot reproduce with each other. So that's how we know that the horse and the donkey are two different species. So that is our definition of a species, is if things become different enough that they can't reproduce and have offspring that are fertile and the offspring can then reproduce, then we call them two different species. The shift towards one extreme of a trait is known as directional selection. So for example, you look at your giraffe and only the giraffes with the longest necks have survived. This is a directional selection. You're moving toward the direction of long necks. Sometimes the environment favors the trait that's sort of right in the middle. So it's not the extreme. They call this stabilizing selection. And other times the conditions lead to two different extremes being selected. So maybe if you're looking at an animal, only the animals that are the very smallest and the very largest survive. Maybe the very largest can run really fast and get away from predators, and maybe the very smallest can hide really easily. But the ones that are right in the middle, the middle size, they can't run that fast and they can't hide in small little burrows in the ground, so they die out. And they call this disruptive selection when the ones on either extreme survive. Here's a picture of just saying that same thing. So let's say this is our original variation. You have birds of all these different, you have some white, some sort of grayish in the middle, and some darker brown. Directional selection would be you just select maybe the darkest of the birds only survive. Stabilizing selection would mean the birds sort of that medium color survive. And disruptive selection means only the birds on the extreme, so only the very lightest and the very darkest birds survive. Next, we're going to move on to taxonomy, and that's looking at, we think of taxonomy a lot as how we name things, but the reason we tend to give things certain names is because of their similarities with other organisms. And taxonomy is actually looking at how organisms, how their features are similar, and then giving them names and putting them into groups based upon these similar features. So, for example, we put like bacteria, all these one-celled living organisms that are made up of just one cell, we put them into the category of the bacteria. And organisms that are made of more than one cell, we put them into the category of eukarya, or things that essentially have a nucleus in their cell, but for a little more commonly, these are things like ants, ants, plants, fungi, and protists, so organisms that have many cells and are much more complex. Here's a look at taxonomy. So essentially, you have your bacteria here that are just these single-celled organisms, so they sort of show blobs of these bacteria all put together, but really this is one organism, one living organism, this is another, just a group of bacteria sort of all clumped here together. Then your bacteria do not have this thing called a nucleus in their cell. They just have their DNA loose inside the cell. All these other things, plants, animals, fungi, they have in the center of their cell this thing called a nucleus that is like this little sac that holds the DNA neatly in the center of the cell. And so in taxonomy, we try to make sort of this chart of saying, okay, all these things over here don't have a nucleus. All these things over here do have a nucleus. And then we break things into further categories like plants, who tend to be still and rely on photosynthesis to get their nutrients, which differ from animals who tend to move and tend to have to eat other things to get their nutrients. They can't produce their own food. So we break these things into all these different categories, and this is called taxonomy. So these are the different, what they call different kingdoms of life. So you have your plant kingdom, your animal kingdom, your bacteria kingdom, and scientists usually talk about only the two most specific levels of taxonomy, the genus and the species, when they refer to a species. And they call the genus and species name a binomial name or binomial nomenclature, and bi just means two, nome means name, so it means you're giving things two names. You're giving them a genus name and a species name. We write them in Latin so that no matter what country you're in, you would say the name of these, the scientific name of these species, the same way no matter where you are, and it cuts down on confusion. Because no matter where you go, you know that you're talking about the same plant or animal or bacteria. So let's look a little bit here on taxonomic hierarchy. So one of the most broad categories here, some people break it even broader into a domain, but here in your textbook on this chart, the most broad category is the kingdom. That's things like your animal kingdom or your plant kingdom or your bacteria kingdom. And the next, if you go a little more specific, so let's say we want to look at the different types of animals. We could break them into different groups, and one group that you could break animals into is the chordata, or the animals with a backbone. And then you can take all animals with a backbone. You probably learned somewhere in school about different classes, even if you didn't call them classes, but we have the mammals, the reptiles, the fish. So this would be the class. So mammals, for example, are things that tend to have live birth and have milk for their young. The next category down we have here is the order. And order, there's different types of mammals. You have your rodents, you have your primates. So for example, humans are in the order of primates. Then going even a little more specifically, you have your family, and humans are in the family Hominidae. And then you have your genus, which the genus of humans is Homo, and your species, the genus of, or the species name is Homo sapiens. And then you even have a subspecies, which is going even a little more specific. So we're Homo sapiens sapiens. You could go through with corn and go through all the different kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And usually what we tend to talk about the most is this genus and species name. To help you remember the order, a lot of people come up with a little mnemonic, or looking at the first letter here of each word and make a little sentence. You may have heard one of these before, but for example, like K for kingdom. So we have kangaroos playing chase on freeways get smashed. I know that's not very nice, but sometimes it is just useful to have something that helps you remember the order. So K for kingdom, P for phylum, C for class. You could also say keep pots clean or family gets sick. That's the same thing, mnemonic, where these first letters stand for this order. So if you get to a test and you need to remember this order, which you will, you can even come up with your own clever sentence, whatever helps you out to remember this order here. Next here, section 3.2, we have species interactions, and interactions with other species help shape the species' traits and behaviors. So if an organism didn't interact with anything else, it probably wouldn't need to change because there would be no reason to change. So for example, when we talked about our rabbit and our fox from the lab, if there was no fox and the rabbit could just reproduce indefinitely and didn't have to ever hide or run away for anything, there'd really be no reason for it to change. No color would be better than the other. But when they interact with other species, there's competition. So the rabbit might have other rabbits that it's competing with, and predation, like the fox trying to chase them down, that cause the species to evolve or change in response to others' attributes. And what I'd like to point out here is that when we look at evolving, we can be talking about here something as simple as just that the rabbits who are the fastest, whatever rabbits happen to get the fastest genes, those are the ones that are going to survive to that next generation. Like we talked about long legs, it might be just that the rabbits get longer and longer legs over time because you're selecting for that long leg gene. And cooperative interactions and interdependent relationships also can have advantages which lead to evolution of traits. So sometimes animals evolve together because they might work together in a certain way. So for example, a certain bee may be pollinating a flower. The bee and the flower might sort of change together over time in a way that maybe the flower will get bigger for the bee if the bee liked a certain type of flower, and the bee would keep coming to that flower and keep pollinating the flower, and the bee might, certain features might change over time to be better suited to be able to get the nectar out of that flower, maybe, for example. So in this section, next section, we're going to look at the interactions between species that affect their success and help shape these communities. As we talked about, any animals who have a similar niche in an ecosystem or have similar needs and similar areas where they go, similar foods they eat, are going to compete with each other. And competition is a type of relationship within a community. They say it's antagonistic, which means it's not a positive interaction working together, but more a negative interaction. And it's where organisms are competing for resources that are in limited supply. So if there was unlimited supply of some resource, then it wouldn't really be competition if the organisms both needed it. It's only when that resource is limited that they would consider that competition. If members of the same species are competing against each other, then it's called intraspecific competition. And so let's say we're looking at the rabbit and the fox, and the rabbits are trying to find enough food to eat, and there's not a lot of food to go around, and they're all trying to find food, and only certain rabbits are getting enough food. That's intraspecific competition. If there's competition between members of different species, so for example, let's say the rabbit and the fox were both trying to get enough water to drink, then they would call that interspecific competition. So competition between the fox and the rabbit and between two different species. Predation is one thing that affects species relationships. And we tend to only think of carnivores as predators, but really as a predator is any organism that feeds directly on another organism, whether or not it kills the prey. So an herbivore, carnivores and omnivores, which all eat another food source, are all considered predators. So for example, a rabbit eating a plant, it's a predator to the plant because the plant is a living organism. It is part of the community. It is competing with other plants for water and resources, so we can't just look at whether they're eating other animals, but also whether they're eating any other living things. And even scavengers and things that eat on, if you're looking at like parasite, not a scavenger. Parasites are also predators. They don't kill the prey, but for example, you might have a tick feeding off of a deer, and that tick is also a predator on that deer. Things like scavengers, detritivores, and decomposers, things which feed on dead things, are not considered predators. Here we just have herbivory as a type of predation. So here you have the milkweed caterpillar here that's going to turn into the nice monarch butterfly, feeding on a plant, and the caterpillar is eating the plant, and that is a type of the caterpillar is a predator to that plant. When we look at the predator and prey relationships within a community, we have to also keep in mind that sometimes an organism does not have the same predator-prey relationships throughout its entire life cycle. So if an organism is very different when it's young versus when it's an adult, like a larvae versus a insect or a tadpole versus a frog, they can have completely different organisms that they eat or that they're eaten by because they live in such different habitats and as their life cycle changes. So for example, here we have the tadpoles on the right eating, the upper right eating a plant, and then the frog on the lower right eating an insect. And so they're eating completely different things depending on where they're at in their life cycle. Predation does, of all things, although it may not seem good for the animal at the time, it leads to adaptations for that animal to be better to survive. And the reason for this is that only the animals that are good at surviving are going to survive. So they call this selection pressure, and this is pressure that favors whatever the adaptation is that makes them more likely to survive. On the other hand, predators become more efficient at feeding and searching for their prey, and the prey become more effective at escaping and avoiding. So as time goes on, the predators become better at getting the prey, but the prey also become better at getting away. And they call this co-evolution, when two organisms sort of evolve together. So an example of predation leading to adaptation here is this poison arrow frog. And the poison arrow frog is super poisonous. It has secretions on its skin that are lethal to other organisms. And the poison is actually used by like the indigenous people in Latin America to make their poison blowgun darts. And over time, the frogs have developed this bright color pattern, and it helps other organisms that were their predators to recognize that this is not something you want to eat. So if it didn't have this striking color difference, some of them might just randomly get eaten because the other organism didn't realize what they were eating until it was too late and they're already feeling sick and dying. Whereas with this very noticeable color pattern, the animal is more likely to survive, even though whether it had the color pattern or not, it would have been toxic, but they're more likely to survive because other animals will recognize them and not try to eat them in the first place. Prey can also have another type of adaptation, which is camouflage, and species can have different either forms or colors or patterns that help them to hide. So for example, here we have like the stick bug, and it looks exactly like a stick. So things can look like dead leaves or twigs. It's pretty neat. And some of these, when they're sitting on a twig, you would have a hard time even seeing that they're there. Other organisms, like the chameleons, can change colors. Lots of neat adaptations animals have to blend into their environment. Another really neat thing that happens with organisms is something called mimicry. And mimicry is when you have one organism that is harmful, and so it tends to survive because, as you all know, you don't really want to mess with a bee that's going to sting you. And a lot of other animals have learned this as well, so they stay away from the bee or the wasp. And so things that happen to look like this wasp, like this beetle here, has a similar color pattern, the beetle on the bottom picture. And other organisms tend to see that black and yellow striped color pattern and just stay away, not even get close enough to see if it is a wasp or not. And this beetle tends to survive very well just because it looks similar to this wasp. And that is a defense mechanism of this beetle looking similar to the bee. So probably happened over time that the more similar that the beetle looked to the bee, the more it got left alone. And so over time, the beetles that looked the most similar to the bee survived, passed on their genes, and over time, this beetle ended up looking more and more like the bee. And again, this is called mimicry. So when organisms interact together and they somehow both have an impact, one organism has an impact on the other and the other on that first organism, they call this symbiosis, and that just means that two organisms or two species live and interact frequently together throughout their lives. And there's different types of symbiotic relationships or relationships between two different organisms. The first one here we have is mutualism, and that's when the relationship is mutually good for both. So for example, when a bee pollinates a flower, it's good for the bee because they get the nectar that they need as a food source, and it's good for the flower because it spreads the flower's pollen from plant to plant and helps the flower to reproduce. And that's mutualism, when it's good for both. Commensalism is when one thing benefits and the other doesn't hurt them. It's not good or bad in any way. It really doesn't affect them. So for example, a moss growing on a tree, it's good for the moss to have that tree to grow on. The moss gets the nutrients that it needs and gets a place to live. But it really is not, it doesn't hurt the tree and it doesn't benefit the tree. And lastly, parasitism, which we've talked a little bit about, but one of the species benefits and the other species is harmed. And this is a type of predation where, let's say you have your tick and your deer, and the tick is benefiting by getting the blood deer, and the deer is being slightly harmed by losing a little bit of its blood and possibly getting some diseases spread to it. Here's just a chart showing that same thing. So we have our two, species 1, species 2, mutualism, good for both. Commensalism, good for one, zero effect on the other. Parasitism, good for one, bad for the other. Predation, since parasitism is a type of predation. With predation, you have also good for one, bad for the other. And then in competition, there's some good and bad for both. So there can be, it can vary depending on which organism at the time is getting more of the resources.
A swamp in South America. An abundance of water and a warm tropical sun make it a paradise for insects of all kinds. A kind of flycatcher, a cattle tyrant. And another obliging partner, a capybara, a large semi-aquatic rodent. As the capybara moves around, it inevitably disturbs insects of some kind or another. And what better place for an insect eater to spot them than sitting on the back of one? The view be any better from there? Perhaps it would be. A few of these partnerships between birds and other kinds of animals have become very intimate indeed. The hide of a hippo may not seem a particularly rich source of insects, but there are little ticks to be had in the various cracks and crannies, and oxpeckers go there to search for them. They have extremely sharp claws with 2 toes pointing forwards and 2 backwards, so that they can cling at any angle, even on a slippery hippo. Land animals with hair on their hide are likely to be more productive ground. Oxpeckers pay particular attention to their ears. That's the sort of place where you might find a tick, and if there is one, the oxpecker will remove it. And they also eat ear wax. Dandruff is another part of their diet. Their beaks are flattened so that with their head held sideways, they can comb through their host's hair. Oxpeckers spend all their lives on or closely beside their animal hosts. They court and mate on their backs, and when they fly off to make a nest, as they must necessarily do, they pluck hair from their hosts' backs with which to line it. But do they do anything in return? It's true that they remove irritating, even damaging insects that their hosts can't dislodge for themselves, but the bird's main diet is blood. Sometimes they get it by swallowing ticks that are bloated with blood, but they also take it directly, pecking at an animal's wounds to keep them open. When their host gets irritated, then they go back to their toiletry duties before once again snatching a sip.
Keystone species are species that play a really important role in the biological community. And without this keystone species, typically the entire community dynamics can change. And usually the keystone species is a top predator. So if you remember our food chain, it's the predator sitting at the top of that food chain. This is not always the case. We'll go over an example next of something that's not a top predator. But keystone species effects ripple across multiple trophic levels, so they really go down through the food chain and have a big impact. The beaver is an example of a keystone species, and as much as some people don't like beavers, they have some very important ecosystem characteristics that they help to create. And they do everything from by building their dams and creating ponds, they create wetland ecosystems, they create bird nesting habitat, increase fish populations, help recharge the groundwater aquifer in that area, increase waterfowl habitat, and much, much more. So the beavers really help to create a lot of important habitats for a lot of different animals. Another keystone species that is not a top predator is the fig. And the fig is a species in the rainforest that produces fruit year-round, whereas most trees do not produce fruit year-round. And this provides a food source and habitat for animals whose diet consists mostly of fruit throughout the year when other fruit is scarce. So this little cartoon over on the right just shows you all the important things that the fig tree does, providing food and shelter, and it says mass employment, so jobs for all these animals, security, place to live, and just a place for all these animals to spend time. So they said, I'd vote for the fig if it ran for prime minister. Keystone species usually have some kind of critical role that they play in the environment. So we talked about the beaver creating wetland habitat and the fig producing that year-round fruit. The otter is another example of a keystone species. And they found when the otters were overhunted down off the coast of like California, Pacific Coast area, when the sea otter was hunted almost to the point of extinction, the sea urchins all of a sudden became much more populous and grazed the kelp until the kelp was completely gone. So they lost the entire kelp ecosystem there. And there's a short video coming up next just showing the importance of otters as a keystone species.
Stretching down the California coast from Big Sur to Monterey Bay is one of the most beautiful marine reserves in the world. But its history teaches us that even a small change can have a huge impact on an ocean ecosystem. In the 19th century, fur trappers hunted the California sea otter to the point of extinction, and when they disappeared, the kelp forests of Monterey Bay disappeared with them. At the time, no one knew that this adorable little mammal held the keys to an entire ecosystem. It took a big bit of luck and our protection. But the otters came back, and this is what they brought back with them.
40 or 50 years ago, we wouldn't see this kelp forest in this cove. We wouldn't see all of this productive algae. It would be pretty much gone. And the reason is that the whole cove here would have been full of sea urchins eating the kelp. Without the otters here to eat the sea urchins, the kelp forest couldn't live.
I'm going to briefly cover here organisms' growth over time, and this has a lot to do with a lab that we completed last week. If an organism is growing and reproducing at unlimited rates, and they're not limited by food or predators, they call this their biotic potential. And this is just the unrestrained growth of and reproduction of an organism. At this growth curve here, it should be a little bit familiar from your lab. And when an organism is having that unlimited growth, they tend to grow exponentially. So their numbers go up, up, up. And they call this a J curve because this curve takes on the shape of a J. The growth starts out slowly, and then eventually, as the numbers become more and more of that population, their growth shoots up very rapidly as more and more of those members start to reproduce. What tends to happen is after a while, the organisms pass what they call the carrying capacity, which is the amount of organisms that environment can actually maintain and provide enough food and habitat for. And once they pass beyond that point, there's not enough food or habitat for these animals to live, and the numbers will go up for a little bit, but eventually they're going to start dying off because there's just not enough food and resources for these animals. So they tend to die even below carrying capacity until eventually the numbers will stabilize again, the resources build back up, and their numbers start to increase. And you see this cyclical pattern here. This also should look very familiar from last week's lab. And this is an example of the snowshoe hare and the Canada lynx. And the hare is the prey and the lynx is the predator. And as you can see here, their numbers cycle up and down together over time. And as you saw in your lab, as you change various factors like birth rate and death rate, these cycles will become more or less dramatic. Now, a lot of organisms will not have this unlimited exponential growth forever and may not have these rapid up and down cycles that we've seen in the last few cycles. Because a lot of organisms, as their numbers go up and up and up, and they start to be using up all their resources, the numbers level off. So instead of shooting way above the carrying capacity or the amount of organisms that the environment can hold, they level off at that carrying capacity. And then you don't see as much of that up and down, unless there's some kind of large-scale disturbance. Now, they call this curve an S-shaped curve. So because it looks somewhat like an S, whereas the exponential curve is your J curve. This curve of logistic growth is your S curve. Now we've talked that some species have this exponential growth curve and other times you see this logistic or S-shaped growth curve. And let's talk a little bit about why you see these different types of growth curves and what animals you tend to see these growth curves in, or what organisms. Up at the top here, we have what they call R-selected species, and these are species that tend to reproduce very quickly. An example of this would be like fish or a lot of plant species, and what you see in these species is they tend to be small, reach maturity very quickly, produce lots and lots of offspring at one time, like fish producing thousands of eggs, plant species producing thousands or hundreds of thousands of seeds. And they tend to spend a very little amount of time on their offspring. So they might just lay their eggs and leave them, or maybe make sure that they protect the eggs, but then be gone once the eggs hatch. And so there tends to be a very high mortality, but since they produce so many hundreds or thousands of eggs, still quite a few will survive. And with these organisms, you tend to see that J growth curve, so where the numbers just shoot really, really high, and then they might drop and cycle through again. In contrast, we have K-selected species, and they have much slower growth and tend to live at conditions near the carrying capacity. So they tend not to go over their carrying capacity, and you see that S-shaped growth curve. And these organisms, an example would be mammals, so for example ourselves, and we are larger, slower to mature, spend a lot of time on our offspring, have a fairly low, relatively low mortality, at least compared to these our selected guys up here. And you see that S-shaped growth curve. So the numbers will go up and up and up, but as they reach carrying capacity, start to level off. Next here, we're going to look at community diversity and look at the different structure of communities that we see within an ecosystem. When we talk about diversity within a community, we're referring to the number of different species that are in that area. So the number of different species per unit. So you might see the number of different species in a 1 acre plot or in a 100-mile area. And sometimes this is referred to as biodiversity, or just the diversity of the biotic organisms or the diversity of life. Abundance refers to how many individuals you have of each species. So do you have a lot of that species living in an area, or do you have just a few of that species living in an area? Usually diversity and abundance are related, and if you have a very high diversity, you tend to have a low abundance of each species. And the reason for this is that each environment can only hold a certain number of organisms total and support that number of organisms. So if you have hundreds of different species within an area, you're probably only going to have a handful of each of those species. Whereas if you only have maybe 10, 15 species in this big area, you might see a lot of each of those individuals. Now, the individuals can be arranged in different ways within a community. And there's 3 different distribution types that we talk about. We talk about random, ordered or uniform, or patchy distribution. And in randomly distributed populations, the individuals just live wherever the resources are available and wherever they happen to settle. So for example, a plant scattering seeds in the wind, and the seeds land and grow wherever they are scattered to. In a uniform distribution, you see the animals or plants very laid out, like they look very organized. And it tends to be from competition or territoriality, that they don't get too close to the other one, and they tend to be a certain distance apart. And patchy distribution results when species clump together for protection, like a fish, a school of fish in the ocean. And so whenever you find one, you tend to find a whole bunch. Here's a look at those different types of distribution. So on the left here, in picture A, we have random distribution, plants just growing wherever they happen to, the seeds happen to fall. In the center, we don't see this as often, this type of distribution, but here's an example of penguins and their nests, and they've made very uniform distribution. So they are all spaced very close together and very organized pattern. And then on the right-hand side, we see our school of fish, and their distribution is patchy. So when you find one, you find a whole bunch, and then you might not see any for a little while. It's important to keep in mind that when you look at distribution, not to just look at the ground level, but that different populations can live at different heights as well within an ecosystem. So some animals will live on the ground, some animals midway up along the trunks of the trees, and some animals only in the canopies or the tops of the trees. Now, communities tend to form patterns within the landscape, and some different patterns that we talk about are core habitat and edge effects. So some communities tend to like to live in that core habitat, which is a large patch of relatively uniform environment, free from the influence of the edges. So if you think of a city park, near the edges of the city park where your city is, you might have a lot of influence of people coming and going and hiking and recreating in the park on the edges. But if you had a really large park, not as many people would come to the center and impact that core area. On the other hand, we have edge effects, and edges are often very important parts of an ecosystem, and this is where communities meet. So for example, if you have a forest and a meadow area, the boundary between that forest and the meadow is called the edge, and the edge area provides a very important habitat for a lot of species, because a lot of species tend to live in the forest for protection and then go into the meadow, which is a little more open, to get food and water and other things. And so they'll go back and forth between those areas and tend to live right near those edges. Here's an example of, you can see the different types of habitats. So here you have your core area, and then along this area you have your edges. Depending on whether you want to have a lot of edges or you want to have a large core area, depends on what type of environment would be good under different circumstances. So for example, if you were a city planner and you wanted a park that would help benefit organisms that like that edge area, you might design a park like this top picture that has a lot of edges. On the other hand, if you're a wildlife manager that has a lot of species that depend on that core area, so for example, maybe you're wanting to promote waterfowl in this core in a pond here, you might make more of a round shape to encourage more of that habitat for the species that you're looking for. Now, how resilient communities are to disturbances and other things seems to be related to how complex they are. So complexity refers to the number of trophic levels, or the number of levels within your food chain, and the number of species at each level. So the more complex your food chain is, the more and the more trophic levels there are, and the more organisms at each trophic level, the more likely that the community will survive when some kind of a disturbance happens. And a disturbance could be some kind of disease, or it could be something like a fire, and more complex communities tend to survive better. Here's a look at how much biomass, or if you were to just take every living thing and in a community and weigh it and see how heavy it was and how dense that area is with life. This chart shows us for each of these different biomes or ecosystems how much life is there. And the desert tends to not have a lot of life per area if you were to weigh it all out. Arctic tundra type areas and high mountains have a little more, but still not a lot. Grasslands a little more, still not a lot. As you go up to your coniferous and deciduous forests, you tend to have a little bit more biomass. Intense agriculture, quite a bit. And your tropical rainforests and estuaries and coral reefs have the most biomass here. So you can see they're over at the far right-hand side. And estuaries are pond-like areas between the ocean and the land that are sort of half saltwater, half freshwater. And coastal zones, and then going to the open ocean, you start to see a drop-off in the amount of living things living condensed within a certain area. We used to think that a healthy community should be stable. Now we know in actuality that healthy communities are actually constantly undergoing changes. So they're having various things happen in that community that change the plants and animals and the structure of that community. The process of a community changing over time is called succession. And in succession, we're following how the organisms change from essentially there being not much of anything in the community to having a very productive community. We tend to have primary succession when something's happened, like a volcano and lava flow has covered everything, or a fire that's burned everything down. And then in primary succession, the first organisms start to come into an area. So you have your first little plants that are starting to break through the soil or the rocks, and the first beginnings of organisms starting to come to eat those plants. And secondary succession occurs after a disturbance. So maybe there was some kind of a flood that washed a lot of stuff out, a medium grade fire that burned some of the stuff up, so not everything's gone. But when a community is sort of coming back after some kind of a large scale disturbance. Whereas primary succession, again, is when there's nothing there and everything is just starting from the beginning. They came up with the term climax community, and that's eventually when the community sort of has reached the point where everything that's trying to grow and come in has grown and come in. So everything that could be there is there, and it happens long after a disturbance and tends to be a fairly stable ecosystem until something else comes along to disturb it. Here's a look at primary succession. So first what you might have is nothing but rocks. Then you might start to have some lichens and mosses coming and growing on those rocks. Then a few other small plants will grow. Eventually you'll start getting a little bit larger plants and trees. And then finally in your climax community, you have your largest plants and trees and all of the animals that live in that diverse ecosystem. So you've got in this community your lichens and your mosses and your grasses and your shrubs and your small trees and your large trees. And so as you can imagine, with all those different types and variety of plants, you have a lot of different types and varieties of animals living there. Some communities need disturbance, and so some species like the knobcone pine, their pine cones will only open if there's a fire. So if there's never a fire, their pine cones will stay closed. Those seeds will just sit there and wait until there's a fire that makes the cones pop open, and then the seeds will grow. And they call these disturbance adapted species. And these are species that need that disturbance and tend to come in large numbers. A lot of weeds, what we think of as weeds, are like that. They come in after a disturbance. If in a climax community, they probably wouldn't survive real well. But it's good to have those species that come in after the disturbance, help colonize the area, and then eventually over time, other species can start coming in. While some communities might do very well after disturbances, some communities, depending on the type of organisms that live there, might take a very long time to come back from a disturbance. And so you have to look at that if you're managing land, and if you're cutting timber from an area that's going to come back really those trees are going to come back really slowly, that might not be the best area to do a big clear cut. If you're managing timber in an area where the species grow very rapidly, you can come in and cut much more frequently. And here's the other end, that some communities recover very quickly from disturbances. So some species are going to come back really quickly, and you'll see that ecosystem look very quickly filled with life. Well, now we've reached the end of the week 3 lecture. As you're going about your week and getting ready for your tests, completing your assignments, please feel free to use the student study area if you think it will help you. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I will be in touch with you again in week 4.